In 1831, a young British officer who had arrived on the Gold Coast a few months prior was running frantically through the bush. Behind him, he could hear the heavy steps and the war cries of the men chasing him. They were getting closer. Now, he could hear their deep voices clearly. It sounded like a commander was giving instructions to his troops as they answered in unison. Soon after, he heard the drums. He could swear the drums were talking, almost repeating syllable for syllable what the commander had ordered. He didn't have time to find out, because they were now running full speed towards him. He threw his rifle to the ground, and his hat he threw in an opposite direction in an effort to be lighter and a little less hot. He didn't know which was going to get him first, the scorching heat which would make him pass out, or his assailants, which he now knew were excellent marksmen. He had no choice. He ran and kept running. Finally, right before sunset, he made it to the gate of the fort. Exhausted, dehydrated, and confused, he could only answer the following when the gatekeepers asked him what happened. "They have muskets! They have muskets! They are invisible!" he cried out. When they tried to calm him down and ask him where his troops were, he buried his hands in his face and started shaking in fear. The only thing they could make out from his gibberish was their name, the Ashanti. His story is a reflection of what the British endured during the 100-year Anglo-Ashanti War, a story which has been mistold for far too long. It is only through a diligent study of the past that one can perceive a mosaic of the self. When the British first met them, they were in awe. Their cities were a marvel of engineering and architecture. Their armies utilized deadly strategies and cutting-edge weaponry, from homemade firearms to military strategies decades ahead of their time. Asante cities had sophisticated urban planning. In fact, we are lucky to have surviving pictures of traditional Ashanti residential dwellings from the late 19th century. Pay attention to the tall columns, very reminiscent of Nubio-Kemetic architecture. The height also doubles as an air cooling mechanism. In this picture you can see a traditional Ashanti dwelling with its characteristic walls, where the lower one-third is painted with a very dark brown, the middle section are painted beige, and the roof is adorned with a heat-dispensing material that is also made in a way to repel tropical rains. To get a sense of how large these houses were, look at the people standing in front of the building and the trees. The capital of the Ashanti Kingdom was in Kumasi. Its layout, radiating from the king's palace, symbolized centralized authority, while hidden tunnels and elevated walkways allowed covert troop movements. The Asante traditional buildings, with their ventilated walls and fire-resistant thatch, were designed for both ceremony and war. A Danish trader, Wilhelm Müller, noted in 1700, "Their palaces are cooler than our stone forts, their walls adorned with wisdom older than scripture." Their empire was modular and hierarchical, enabling them to quickly respond to threats. They employed ingenious methods of long-distance communication. Their impact on people in the region was so strong that many African Americans today are still called after them, Ashanti. And they themselves still carry the name of their true origins, Kufuor, Kofi, and Amun, golden names, just like the gold they coveted so much when they were back in the Nubio-Kemetic civilization complex, ancient Egypt, before they migrated back to the interior of the continent. And those ancient Kemites found their new home in the Ghana Empire first, before settling down in the Ghana of today, where they became the Ashanti. They barely had time to start rebuilding their past grandeur, that the white man came at their shore, bearing guns and a notion that those who live in the jungle are inferior. But the Ashanti were ready, and soon they would show those who reddened too quickly under the hot West African sun why their civilization hid their multi-story fortresses in the dense wood of Ghana. I would like to take 10 seconds here to remind you all that Without History does not accept any sponsorship precisely so that we can remain independent. And it is through all your small donations on Patreon, YouTube, and those who share our videos on their social media that we are able to continue our work. As the Ashanti proverb goes, no small contribution is too small. It lasted 100 years. 100 years during which the Ashanti and the British fought a grueling war, culminating in the famous Battle of the Golden Stool, the fight to save the heart of the empire. And through this war, the Ashanti showed their brilliance, their technological innovation, their cultural pride. They showed that they are the true descendants of Amun. But above all, they would show that coming out of the Middle Ages, Africa had recovered from the tragedy of the drying up of the Sahara and was well on its way to progress. And it all started on a sunny day in early 1820 when the British wanted more than trading with the African Gold Coast. They wanted the source of that gold, and they coveted the symbol of the Ashanti Empire, the Golden Stool, a throne completely made out of gold, which legend said had descended from the heavens, a gift from the chief deity Onyame himself. It is this stool and the spirit of the Ashanti that the warrior king, Osei Bonsu, and his troops would give their blades, their guns, and their lives to defend in 1823 in the First War against the British, and the outcome of this epic clash would determine the future of West Africa itself. By the early 19th century, the Ashanti Empire, centered in modern-day Ghana, had become a regional hegemon. Founded in the late 17th century by Osei Tutu I, the empire united Akan clans under the spiritual authority of the Golden Stool, a sacred symbol of nationhood. The Ashanti controlled lucrative goldfields, kola nut trade routes, and a vast network of tributary states. Their wealth and military prowess allowed them to dominate the interior, while coastal trade remained contested. Britain, having abolished transatlantic human trafficking in 1807, sought to replace it with legitimate commerce in gold, ivory, and palm oil. Coastal forts like Cape Coast Castle and Elmina became hubs for this trade. However, Ashanti control over inland supply routes threatened British profits. The Fante people, coastal allies of Britain, resented Ashanti dominance, setting the stage for conflict. The Ashanti were led by the warrior king, Osei Bonsu. Born into the royal Oyoko clan, Osei Bonsu was trained in statecraft, warfare, and the sacred traditions of the Golden Stool. His mentors included generals who had expanded the empire under his predecessor, Osei Kwame Panyin. In the tradition of the Ashanti, the king needed to be enlightened and knowledgeable in order to lead, but he also needed to have a just heart. To get a measure of the man, one should listen to the words he uttered to his court in 1804, saying, "The Golden Stool does not kneel. Our ancestors watch us. We will not falter." On the Atlantic coast bordering the Gulf of Guinea, Sir Charles McCarthy, a brash Irish governor, arrived in 1821 with a mandate to reshape the Gold Coast. To McCarthy, the Ashanti were little more than savages, obstructing Britain's civilizing mission. He dismissed their sophisticated governance and military prowess, convinced that a show of force, cannons, rockets, and European discipline would bend the Ashanti to his will. "A few volleys," he boasted, "and these naked warriors will scatter like ants." McCarthy sought to dismantle Ashanti power by supporting Fante autonomy. He dismissed Ashanti military capabilities, writing, "A disciplined European force will scatter these naked warriors like chaff." The Ashanti had an army 45,000 men strong. They were drawn from across the empire's provinces, with elite units armed with muskets and swords. However, their main force consisted of warriors with bows, spears, and locally made firearms. The rearguard consisted of medics, porters, and reserves. Almost all Ashanti warriors carried the dreaded Akrafina sword, a swordsmith marvel that gave its carrier superior maneuverability. It had a counterweight at the base of the handle that served to improve an already sturdy grip, but also increased angular momentum. The Akrafina is just majestic to look at, certainly one of the most beautiful swords ever smelted. But it is the Ashanti homemade firearm that most have never heard of. Indigenous Ashanti blacksmiths reverse-engineered European muskets, producing Dane guns, flintlocks, and gunpowder that came from local saltpeter. And an army of 45,000 men is useless unless it is supported by an effective supply chain. And the Ashanti supply chain was made of porters who carried food, ammunition, and herbal medicines. To coordinate such a large army, the Ashanti had invented the talking drum, a language understood by all Ashanti, where the tones of the drum mimic the spoken words. This same talking drum was also used in long-distance communication between towns and relay stations throughout the jungle and terrain. The British had 2,500 well-equipped troops and were supported by the Royal African Corps, locally recruited soldiers with many of Fante heritage. The British also had within their ranks British regulars. The men of King George IV were equipped with Brown Bess muskets and 6-pounder cannons. They also had ships that could blockade the coasts and bombard sea-facing settlements. They also sported a full regalia, complete with the shako hat, or the foreign soldier hand, and their trousers. Take note of this, as it will become very important during the course of the battle. Every conflict requires a spark, and for the First Anglo-Ashanti War, it came in the form of an action of disrespect towards the Ashanti. Though nominally Ashanti subjects, they chafed under tribute demands and sought British protection. When the Fante rebels murdered an Ashanti trader and fled to British-held Cape Coast Castle, Ose Bonsu demanded justice. McCarthy refused, sealing the fate of both empires. Ohene Ose Bonsu, the King Ose Bonsu, summoned provincial chiefs to Kumasi, declaring, "The white man insults the Golden Stool. We march to teach him respect." Warriors were ritually purified, muskets were built, swords were made, drums were strung, and herbalists prepared antidotes for poison arrows. Hearing of the Ashanti advance, McCarthy assembled his force of 2,500 men, including Fante allies, and marched inland in January 1824. He ignored warnings about Ashanti strength, writing, "Their numbers are exaggerated. A few volleys will send them running." The Ashanti scouts alerted the Ashanti general that the British were advancing to meet them in battle. General Nsamankow immediately understood that the British had made a fatal flaw and decided to use the terrain to his advantage. First, he made the British extend their march inland by deliberately slowing the pace of his advance. The British soldiers, in full uniform, were quickly becoming tired from the long march under the scorching, humid equatorial sun. In addition to the heat, the mosquitoes were adding to their pain with malaria-induced casualties. General Nsamankow lured McCarthy's column into a narrow forest path near the Pra River. There, The general had camouflaged the Ashanti warriors with plant dyes, and they lay in wait. The long British column made its way down the narrow path, with cavalry in front, musketeers in the follow, and artillery and supplies in the trail. At this point, the English were tired from the 3-day march. The heat has a way of sapping the energy of men who are not used to it. And when the legs are gone, so is the resolve to fight. Where before the English had mocked the Africans for their light outfits, they would soon realize that their imperial military clothing was now fighting against them. They needed to win this God-forsaken war, and they needed to win it fast. McCarthy, though, only had one thing in mind: teaching the West African a lesson. And so he pressed on. When the Ashanti general was confident that the British governor had committed all his troops to the narrow path, he gave the signal. The talking war drums signaled the attack. The British were completely caught by surprise and didn't even have time to set their muskets ready before being hit with repeated volleys from the Ashanti marksmen. Ashanti snipers targeted British officers, killing McCarthy in the initial volleys of fire. This sent an immediate shockwave to the already confused and tired colonists. With no commanding officer and completely caught in the open, and with an enemy that seemed to come out of nowhere and fire from everywhere, the British troops soon broke rank with every man for himself. For those who tried to man some form of resistance, their Congreve rockets misfired in the tropical humidity. As for the Fante support, they knew the might of the Ashanti, and they fled. The rest of the British army tried to make through the thick jungle, but most were killed or captured by the Ashanti swordsmen. The Ashanti have a terrifying war cry that they still utter till this day in competition. Ukum apim a, apim biba, meaning, if you kill 1,000, 1,000 will come. It must have been a dreadful sight and experience for those British soldiers as the drums, the gunfire, the war cries of the Ashanti, all merged to constrict the hearts and the hands of those who thought they were savages. How could savages outsmart them on battle strategy, and how did they make guns of their own? On the accounts of a surviving British soldier, Lieutenant John Hope Smith, he wrote, and I quote, "The forest itself seemed alive with enemies. We fired blindly into the trees, but they picked us off like birds." The British lost 250 men that day, including Governor McCarthy, and 100 more soldiers were captured. The Asante pursued the fleeing British to the coast, besieging Cape Coast Castle for months. Though the war ended in stalemate, 1831, the Treaty of Pra affirmed Asante sovereignty over the interior. Asantehene Ose Yaa Akoto proclaimed, "Let the white man keep his sand by the sea. The forest and the gold belong to us." Following the defeat of the British at the Battle of Nsamankow, the Ashanti retained control of inland trade routes, while Britain kept coastal forts. The battle shattered myths of European invincibility. As Ose Bonsu's successor, Ose Yaa Akoto, famously declared, "The white man's power is a mirage. Our roots are deeper than his cannons." The British came to the realization that they had misjudged the Ashanti Empire, but the English would learn from this and would apply cunning of their own. They only accepted the treaty in order to buy time before their next move. After the treaty that ended the First Anglo-Ashanti War, conflict erupted periodically between the Ashanti and the British. The Second and Third Anglo-Ashanti Wars followed a similar pattern, each concluding with a treaty that ultimately left the British in a stalemate with the Ashanti. However, with each conflict, the Ashanti lost ground, primarily due to the introduction of superior British weaponry. The advent of the machine gun during the scramble for Africa in the late 1880s and early 1890s decisively shifted the balance of power in favor of the British. The Ashanti's traditional education and industrial systems were also severely disrupted during the latter half of the 19th century. Previously, they possessed public schools, military academies, a class of inventors, smelters, and a robust production of locally made firearms. Now, the Ashanti were significantly weakened. The British made increasingly bold demands. The burning of Kumasi in 1874 during the Third Anglo-Ashanti War resulted in the loss of numerous ancient cultural and architectural treasures. The remaining Ashanti forces were pushed further into the interior of the country, where the British still struggled to penetrate. It is within this context that a young noble girl would be born, a girl who would give her life to preserve the soul of a nation. The immediate spark for the war can be traced to an act of profound sacrilege. Colonial administrators, in their hubris and misunderstanding of Ashanti spiritual life, demanded that the Golden Stool be presented to them, a symbol that they believed could serve as a tangible token of subjugation. This demand, utterly inconceivable to the Ashanti, struck at the heart of their identity. As the elder statesman of the Ashanti proclaimed in defiant tones, "You see, what the British had not understood about the Golden Stool was that this very object was believed by the Ashanti to house the very soul of all the Ashanti people, and to save their soul, they would fight more than they did to save their gold. It is that resolve that the British had underestimated." Born in 1840 and besieged to Kwaku Ampoma and Atapo, Yaa Asantewaa initially lived a life typical of an Ashanti woman, cultivating crops and entering a polygamous marriage. However, her familial connection to the ruling elite, through her brother Afrane Panen's chieftaincy of Edweso, foreshadowed her future involvement in the political sphere. Her selection as Queen Mother by her brother, Nana Akwasi Afrane Okpase, elevated her to a position of significant influence. The Queen Mother held a revered status within the Ashanti hierarchy, responsible for safeguarding the sacred Golden Stool, advising the Asantehene, king, and participating in the selection of his successor, and she would use the full power of her title to galvanize the nation. The Ashanti Confederacy during Yaa Asantewaa's tenure as Queen Mother faced a period of internal strife and external pressure. The Civil War from 1883 to 1888 exposed the fragility of the Confederacy, weakening its ability to resist the growing threat of British imperialism. This internal conflict, coupled with the increasing assertiveness of British colonial administrators, created a volatile environment. Yaa Asantewaa astutely recognized the dangers posed by both internal divisions and external aggression. When her brother died in 1894, she exercised her prerogative as Queen Mother to nominate her own grandson as Ejisuhene, a strategic move aimed at consolidating power and potentially mitigating further internal conflict. However, the British, viewing the Ashanti as an obstacle to their complete control of the Gold Coast, exiled the young Ejisuhene, along with King Prempeh I and other prominent Ashanti leaders, to the Seychelles in 1896. The exile of her grandson meant the loss of the continuity of leadership for the Ashanti. Queen Mother Yaa Asantewaa now saw it all too clearly. So, when, in 1900, the British Governor-General of the Gold Coast, Sir Frederick Hodgson, demanded the surrender of the Golden Stool, Yaa Asantewaa sprung to action. A secret meeting was convened in Kumasi to discuss a response, and it was during this meeting that Yaa Asantewaa delivered her now famous call to arms. Witnessing the hesitation and fear among some of the male chiefs, she rose and delivered a powerful indictment of their cowardice. How can a proud and brave people, like the Asante, sit back and look while white men took away their king and chiefs and humiliated them with a demand for the Golden Stool. The Golden Stool only means money to the white men. They have searched and dug everywhere for it. I shall not pay one predwan to the governor. If you, the chiefs of Asante, are going to behave like cowards and not fight, you should exchange your loincloths for my undergarments." Yaa Asantewa's impassioned plea, coupled with her strategic acumen, led to her unprecedented appointment as the war leader of the Ashanti forces. This was a remarkable departure from tradition, as no woman had ever held such a position in Ashanti history. It underscored the gravity of the situation and the immense respect Yaa Asantewaa commanded. The combination of the falling Ashanti Empire and the intentional divisions sown by the British had meant that civil conflict was rampant. But soon, village after village, clan after clan, were enlightened by the call of the Queen Mother. They all rallied behind her, the woman who now embodied the spirit of the Ashanti, more so than the Golden Stool itself, the mother protector of Ashanti. Her acumen on the battlefield was as sharp as her power of persuasion. She would lure the British in the dense forest, where their artillery and machine guns had reduced efficacy. Her troops would then pick apart the British in non-conventional formation and engagement patterns. So much so that the remaining British forces, unable to face them in the field, had to retreat to the fort of Kumasi. The rebellion, which commenced in March 1900, saw the Ashanti forces, under Yaa Asantewa's leadership, lay siege to the British fort at Kumasi. The siege demonstrated the military prowess of the Ashanti and the effectiveness of Yaa Asantewa's leadership. The British, caught off guard by the ferocity of the resistance, were forced to send reinforcements to quell the rebellion. The ensuing conflict was brutal and protracted, resulting in significant casualties on both sides. Over 2,000 Ashanti warriors and approximately 1,000 British troops perished in the fighting. This was the bloodiest of the Anglo-Asante wars. Despite their valiant efforts, the Ashanti were ultimately unable to overcome the superior firepower of the British forces. Yaa Asantewaa, along with 15 of her closest advisors, including Nana Akwasi Afrane Okpase, Nana Kwaku Dua, and Nana Afia Kobi Serwa Ampem, were captured and exiled to the Seychelles, effectively ending the organized resistance. The aftermath of the war saw the formal annexation of the Ashanti territories by the British in 1902, marking the end of the Ashanti Empire's independence and its incorporation into the British Gold Coast colony. Despite the military defeat, the War of the Golden Stool, and Yaa Asantewa's role in it, became a powerful symbol of resistance against colonial domination. Yaa Asantewa's defiance, her unwavering commitment to her people's sovereignty, and her willingness to challenge both British imperialism and traditional gender roles cemented her place as a national heroine. The fact that the Golden Stool was never surrendered, despite the British victory, further enhanced the symbolic significance of the war. A fake stool was presented to the British while the real one remained hidden. The spirit of Yaa Asantewaa lives within all of us today, every one of us. Now, the Ashanti remain a proud nation after having fought for their independence and after becoming the first nation in Africa to become independent. Without Yaa Asantewaa, there would be no Ashanti Haini today, the king of the Ashanti, and there certainly wouldn't be the soul of the Ashanti, the Golden Stool, which is now in the royal palace in Kumasi. So next time you hear of the name Ashanti, know that there is royalty running in their veins. The blood of a queen mother who saved a whole continent through her determination. In the 1930s, when Ghanaian women started to rebel against colonialism, it was none other than the mantra of the Queen Mother Yaa Asantewaa they utilized. If you kill 1,000 will come. And today, 1 million souls are here to answer her call. A call of courage, a call of wisdom, a vision of a future where the descendants of Amun, from Accra to Seattle via Haiti and Guyana, we are here. Aha! I caught you again. A whole video without clicking the like button nor leaving a comment. What is it going to be this time? You were doing your workout and couldn't pull your phone out. Shame on you. To my Patreon supporters, YouTube members, subscribers, and anyone that has ever clicked the like button and left a comment, you are the real Ashanti, the sharp blade of the Akrafina, the first general to the Queen Mother's army, the weavers of the Kente cloths, the smelter of the bride's ankh, main ring to the Asantewaa, cavalry to the General Nsamankow, descendants of Amun. I salute you all. Join us and see how those who are said to be without history birthed civilization itself.